Welcome to Warstone Lane Cemetery. My name is Josie and I'm going to be your tour guide for your Catacombs tour today. Warstone Lane Cemetery is one of two cemeteries we have here in the Jewellery Quarter. Key Hill Cemetery opened in 1836. That was the first cemetery in Birmingham of its kind to not be a churchyard, to be a cemetery. And that one was founded by a group of businessmen as a joint stock company. This is a very Victorian idea, making cemeteries something that you make money out of and you have shareholders. But it was a new idea at the time, and the reason that this particular group of businessmen did it was because they were all non-conformist Christians. They were not Church of England Christians. So they were Baptists or Unitarians or Methodists or independent congregations. So they were sick of having to pay fees to the Church of England for burials and for their vicars and ministers not to be able to perform their funerals. So they set up their own private company, the General Cemetery Company, open to all creeds and denominations. And initially it was a very big financial success. So 12 years later, the Church of England went, we want one of those, and that's what we're standing in now. So this was the Church of England Cemetery, also known as St Michael's Cemetery, because the chapel here where we're standing was dedicated to St Michael and All Angels. It also sometimes gets called Brookfield Cemetery on Google Maps because the estate that they bought the land from was the Brookfield estate. And I've heard it called the Mint Cemetery because it's near the Mint. I've also heard it referred to as the Old Cemetery and the New Cemetery. It gets very complicated when you're looking for newspaper records. But the main thing is, this was Anglican, consecrated by the Bishop of Worcester, 1848. And the chapel here was mostly a funerary chapel. They did use it as a parish church for a while in the 1870s when the population of Birmingham was really growing and they needed more churches. But mostly it was here as a place for the funerals to take place. So the design's a bit unusual. We've got a tower at the front, so that's where the archway there marks the arch at the front of the tower, and then a very long cloister here, which was designed as an ambulatory, a place to contemplate and promenade, and the actual nave and chancel were quite small because most funeral services were not attended by lots of people. But imagine it as a really ornate, high Gothic chapel. So if you looked up, the ceiling was blue with gold stars on it. There was stained glass windows, and all the windows made by the Chance Glass Company, at least until the 1890s when the windows blew in the storm. And then it had plain glass. And then unfortunately the reason why we no longer have a chapel here is because in the Second World War the Jewellery Quarter was targeted very heavily by bombing, and some of the bombs hit the roof of the chapel on this side and part of the cloister was left ruined. There are shrapnel marks on a lot of the gravestones. On the way out you go for a wander, you can see craters from where bits of shrapnel from the church hit the gravestones. But so it was left abandoned for about 10 years, and after the war it was demolished because the cemetery was pretty much full by that point, very few funerals taking place here, so sadly the building was demolished rather than repaired. The reason for that is that this idea of having a joint stock company who have shareholders and make money running a cemetery turned out not to work in the long run, because it turns out when you run out of graves to sell, you don't have any income coming in anymore. And they never invested their profits sensibly to keep maintaining the cemeteries. This happened all over the country, and local councils had to compulsorily purchase the cemetery that went to the Catacombs below us, where we're going to visit now. So at the end of the funeral service, the coffin would disappear into the floor, and then the pallbearers would carry it through the tunnel that we're going to visit and out into the correct family catacomb. So that is where we're going today. If you'd like to follow me, we'll start heading in that direction. Before this was a cemetery, it was a sand quarry. So they had some quite dramatic faces to play with, and they kind of used that as a starting point to create this circular structure. They started in the middle in the 1840s and worked their way round, completed it by the 1880s. So the catacombs grew from the middle outwards. And from here we can see all the different kinds of graves in the cemetery. So the catacombs, having one of these doorways lead to your family catacomb, was the most expensive place to get buried. It was a very fashionable idea with the Victorians. They were inspired by the early Christian catacombs underneath Rome, this idea that it's a very continental and fashionable way to be buried. So rich families, like the Chance Glass family, wanted to have a catacomb. The next cost down from there was to buy a family grave and to put a gravestone on it. And then for ordinary working class Brummies who still wanted to have a respectable burial for their family members, you could buy space in one of the public graves. So there were no paupers' graves in this cemetery. They weren't about the, they had shareholders. They weren't going to give anybody a freebie. So this was not for the very, this was for, factory workers, craftspeople, ordinary working class, respectable Brummies would pay for a space in a public grave like this one. But they got you. They made you pay once for the burial and once for the inscription. So sometimes the lists of names are longer than others. That doesn't mean there's fewer people in this grave than this one. It means fewer people paid for the inscription. And these graves are very, very deep. They're actually the depth of the wall opposite. And each person would be buried in their own individual coffin, and then a board would be put over it, the next coffin, and so on. And if you look at the list of names, it tended to be people that died within a year of each other. Then it would be capped. 15 years later they might open it again and add another group of coffins. So this was a cheaper way to still have your family have a resting place with their name on it. So
oh yeah, oh wonderful.
So you've seen the fact that some of the public graves are pretty big. You've probably got a bit of an idea of the extent of the space. Does anybody want to guess how many people are buried in this cemetery?
10,000.
Higher or lower than 10,000?
65,000?
Higher or lower than 65,000?
1 million.
65,000 is about how many people are in Key Hill Cemetery. This one's got 2 acres extra, so they managed to fit 95,000 people. It's just amazing.
4,000.
Yeah.
Just under.
Underestimated.
Yeah, so it's incredible really when you think about it. How a lot of the family graves have got 4, 5, 6 people in as well. So lots of bygone Brummies here, lots and lots of stories to tell. So the space that is formed by the catacombs is probably one of my favourite spaces in the whole of Birmingham. I was just saying to a couple of people that it just feels like a little pocket of paradise because I can't hear the traffic, because we've got the walls creating its own acoustics. And we do actually use this for some performances because of that. So kind of money. The first 4 doors on that side, on the top tier, belonged to the University of Birmingham, and people that donated their bodies to medical science were buried in those catacombs. So that might have been an incentive for some people perhaps, but it was certainly a very nice way of thanking the people that had made that gesture. So in the early 20th century that was the way of getting buried here. Couldn't afford it. So I've got the key. If everybody would like to follow me up. I've just been asked a really good question, and it reminds me to come on to this part of my tour. Originally, all of the family catacombs were sealed with an iron gate, and the family were given a key with their name on it, so that they could go inside and visit their coffins anytime. You would have been able to peek through and see the coffins, so they would have been the very highly ornate ones, like they made handles for at the Coffin Works Museum. If you've not visited that yet, highly recommend it. So imagine, upholstered with rows of nails, solid brass handles, lead-lined coffins, very fancy, and the inscriptions for most of them, so that you knew who was there, would have been inside the catacomb. There are some at Highgate Cemetery where you can still see through the doors, and usually the inscriptions are just inside the doorway or on the back wall, so I imagine it would have been the same here. Unfortunately, because those iron gates were quite easy to break into, in the 1990s the decision was made to prevent vandalism, to contact all the families, get permission to seal them, and that's what they did. So they were bricked up and they were rendered for security reasons, because homeless people were sleeping rough here. There was rumours of a coven of black witches practising magic. So in order to prevent people's coffins being damaged, remains being taken, that was the action. It was make your way out, but please do follow me. Just watch out, as I say, there's some uneven places. This is the worst bit. I think somebody just dropped a whole bucket of half set cement there at some point. After this it gets a little bit better. I'm going to turn mine off because I think there's enough lights on with everybody. Thank you. So, I mentioned that at the end of funerals, coffins were lowered into this tunnel. The catafalque would have just been behind this wall here. The reason that the space we have is not fully open is that you might be able to see that there was once heating pipes for the chapel running along the ceiling here. When they came in to check whether this was all structurally sound, whether it needed any repair work, they discovered that all of those pipes were lagged with asbestos. So the entire contingency for the lottery-funded project was spent on asbestos removal in this tunnel, which means they didn't open up that wall, or that wall, because they would have needed at least another £40,000 for more asbestos removal. So unfortunately, there are little shiny silver seals making sure that no particles of asbestos get through to us, so we're safe. But unless you know somebody that's got the big bucks that wants to make a very generous donation, we won't be going any further into the catacombs, unfortunately. So the space where most of us are standing here is underneath where the tower was. So the archway, the metal archway, is roughly where the people at the back of the group are above, and then we've got a vaulted ceiling that would have held up the tower. So this is a very, very strong structure. So actually when they came in, structurally very little wrong with this whatsoever, perfectly had held up, which I'm not super surprised about, because during the Second World War this was used as an air raid shelter successfully. Despite, you know, bombs falling above, everyone down here was completely fine. So not sure it would have been my first choice of air raid shelter and or temporary accommodation if my house had been bombed out, but at least it was safe. It's always a kind of constant temperature in here because we are so underground. So in the winter it's warmer than outside, which is why the bats like it, and in the summer it's cooler than outside, so it's really nice on a hot day like today to come in here out of the heat. So so to the left and right there were originally cloister catacombs that ran the length of the building. So when you get back up to the chapel garden, just have a look at how long they were. And some of this corridor was divided into family catacombs, but a lot of it was sold as spaces for individual coffins. So I like to say it looked a bit like a wine cellar with shelves with the coffins on, kind of end feet out, with the like with a handle on the end for sliding the coffin in and out. And most of those spaces remained unoccupied. until 1899. Does anybody know Victoria Square in town, where the council house is? When that square was created, they had to demolish a church there called Christ Church. And all of the 112 people that were buried in the crypt there were moved here to the Catacombs. So it did end up nice and full, but it wasn't originally. And I have a story to tell that relates to that. So John Baskerville, the printer, dies 1775. So that's a long time before this cemetery opens. And John Baskerville was a slightly unconventional figure. Some people say he was an atheist, but that's not strictly true. He was what was called a deist, so he believed in God, but he did not believe in organised religion. So he had some quite strong opinions about the priesthood and the church and how they were unnecessary for people to have a relationship with God and the Bible. So one of the things he did as a printer was print, copies of the Bible, beautiful copies of the Bible, but he didn't believe that you needed to go to church. So he didn't want to be buried in a church or a churchyard. His house was called Easy Hill, and it was roughly where the new Library of Birmingham is, so next Baskerville House. And his gardens ran down from there through where the ICC is now and into where Brindley Place is. So in the grounds of his house, in his extensive gardens, there was an old windmill. He had the sails taken off it and he converted it into a mausoleum, and he was buried underneath the windmill. When he died, the house was sold. About 20 years later, the next family were like, I'm sick of staring at that mausoleum. So they knocked it down, and he remained buried underneath where the building had been, but it was no longer marked by a structure. So when putting the canal through, they came across this coffin. I went, oh, that's John Baskerville. Okay. And then about a year later, they were like, no, we really need to put the wharf here, so we're going to have to move them. Okay. And one of the less than scrupulous people involved in the canal building project got the coffin out, took it to his, the yard behind his workshop, and went, looks quite well sealed. Let's open it. Ooh, he's in quite good nick, isn't he? This is a nice lead-lined coffin. People will want to see that. They charged the public an entrance fee to come and have a look at John Baskerville in his coffin. Needless to say, the level of preservation did not remain quite so miraculous because the coffin was being opened so often. For those of you with strong stomachs, on the A-frame over there is a portrait of John Baskerville in life. If you play Lift the Flank, there is a portrait of John Baskerville in death that was sketched by the Birmingham artist Thomas Underwood. So you can start to see that he didn't really stay in the most flattering of conditions for very, very long. Some of his friends who had been left money in the will found out about this, took possession of the body and needed to find somewhere safe for him to go. So unfortunately, he went to the crypt at Christ Church, which meant he only had about 40 years there before he ended up moving again and coming here.
Where he didn't want to be.
Where he didn't want to be. So he spent most of eternity in consecrated ground, but after dying once and being buried anywhere between 3 and 8 times, depending on how technical you get about all of the times things were opened and checked, he's probably just happy to be in one place for the rest of eternity. There was a petition in the 1960s to move him to the Key Hill Catacombs because those are unconsecrated. If we ever get the asbestos removal done, I I'm happy for people to revisit that topic, but until now we can't go looking for his coffin to find out what condition it's in. So for now he has to stay where he is.
Is he sealed up then?
He is sealed up. He's in the corridor on this side. When I finish talking, you're very welcome to come and have a look at this brickwork, because the workers that sealed it up did in fact write "keep out" in the plaster on one of them, so that is a nice little bit of a touch. Probably they wrote that because of the human remains, but it does work as a nice warning for the asbestos as well. And the pile of broken monuments were moved down here from having been at Christchurch. They were put up on the cloister walls upstairs, but unfortunately were damaged in the bombing, so this is what remains of them. So they were stored here for safekeeping, but unfortunately they're far, far too fragile to be put back together. So at some point we might be able to go through and do a bit of a jigsaw puzzle and take photographs or something, but they can't be put back up on display, unfortunately. Marble does that. It's very, very fragile, unfortunately. So I think that's the end of all the stories I wanted to tell. So if anybody's got questions for me, now might be a good time, and then I'll just let you explore a little bit. On the way out, there is some pictures of how the catacombs looked before the doorways were sealed, so do have a look at those. And there are some pictures on this one that show inside the corridors before those were sealed, so do just have a quick look. And unfortunately they're not terribly brilliant photographs, because black and white photography in the dark like this was, you know, a challenge for the photographers. They did their best.
You've talked about this left and right runs underneath what were the cloisters. What happens through that one?
So through it took some of the fear out of death to make things a little bit scientific. So they really did like to you know, have the coffin, rather than being manhandled out of the chapel, having it silently come down into the floor and have the pallbearers come and bear it away again. So this size, maybe a little bit smaller. You probably, if they're similar to the ones at Key Hill that we can see inside that were fitted out and never used, space for about 9 coffins. So shelves for
How many are down here in those 2 corridors?
Space for a couple of hundred, but only about 130 in use. So they weren't completely filled. At both cemeteries, the interior catacombs were not as popular as the exterior ones. So if you're going to pay that money, you want the curb appeal, don't you, of being able to say, you know, this is ours, here we are. So I think that's why. And actually, catacombs in Britain went out of fashion quite fast. By the time they were finishing building both sets in Birmingham, they weren't really being built new ones anywhere else, because the idea has been imported from the continent, from Italy.